Hi, I'm Steve Kapp, a co-founder of From Day One, our forum on corporate values, and we're looking forward to hosting today's webinar. But before I do get started here, I want to share something special we have for attendees of today's webinar. Our next monthly virtual conference is coming up next week, Wednesday, June 16th, and it's about the new benefits that employees need and want today. Thanks to our partners and today's sponsor, we have some complimentary VIP tickets available for those who've joined today's webinar. That's you, of course. I'm putting a link in the chat right now. You'll want to take advantage of it. The regular price for our conference tickets is $149, and this link will give you a free VIP ticket for the whole day's festivities and activities. Now on to today's webinar. We'll be exploring a topic that focuses on talent acquisition, hiring equity, and retention efforts for talent from diverse and underrepresented backgrounds in the tech industry. We'll also be looking at actions companies are taking to increase workforce inclusion. Our title for today's session is Breaking Down Barriers to Build a More Diverse Tech Workforce. Despite lots of efforts to provide greater access to underappreciated prospects, employers still complain about an inadequate talent pipeline, while job candidates still run into exclusionary policies. We'll be exploring a bunch of questions, including how can this gap be bridged? What are the cultural obstacles and structural barriers, and how can they be broken down? What are the hiring trends saying about solutions? Is the bar for entry rising or falling? Since only a small percentage of applicants make it through the process to a technical interview, is it time to loosen the pedigree standards? And finally, among employers, which methods produce the best results in achieving diversity goals? Our sponsor today is Karat. I'll tell you a bit about them. With 24/7 live interviews, enterprise-grade interview infrastructure, and unmatched data visibility, Karat helps companies hire faster and more effectively by unlocking productive engineering hours, improving the candidate experience, and delivering a hiring signal that engineering leaders trust. Now, before we start, a few quick logistical items. This webinar is being recorded and will be available to you on demand soon after the event, so you can look out for an email in about 24 hours with the link. That email will also have info on how you can get professional development credits for this session from the Society of Human Resource Management. And look out for a written account of the conversation soon on our website at fromdayone.co. About 45 minutes after the hour, we'll have a Q&A session. You can submit your questions anytime using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator of distinction, Lydia Dishman, a contributing editor for Fast Company on topics such as tech and leadership. She's written for CBS Money Watch, for Fortune, Popular Science, and the New York Times, among others. Okay, Lydia, take it away.
Thank you, Steve, and thanks everybody for joining us today. This is always a timely topic. I know that we've had these discussions before, and I know that if you're here, you probably don't need to know the business case for having a diverse workforce, but I'm going to repeat some stats that I have used in the past, and I really do think they are important. Racially and ethnically diverse companies are 36% more likely to outperform their competitors. And 83% of executives agree that a diverse workforce improves their organization's ability to capture and retain a diverse client base. 67% of job seekers consider a diverse workforce an important factor when evaluating companies and job offers. Yet, 67% of tech companies are made up of less than 5% Black employees. Controlling for overall racial disparities in tech hiring, white employees are significantly overrepresented in leadership positions, while all other racial groups are underrepresented. Now, this may be due to the fact that only 23% of HR professionals think that D&I programs are highly effective, and many companies struggle with the complexity of diversity in their recruiting efforts, often failing to align their actual practices with their organizational goals. And all this can thwart efforts to attract and retain talent from underrepresented groups. So, here to discuss some better ways that leaders can center hiring practices on these diverse strategies are an accomplished group of insightful professionals that I am delighted to have with me today. So please introduce yourself. Tell us very briefly about your work, a bit of background on where you are in your inclusion efforts. Ivory, starting with you.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. My name is Ivory Johnson. My pronouns are she, her. and I currently lead all of diversity recruiting at Better. I have over 8 years of experience doing DI recruiting work, also talent engagement. I've worked in the tech industry at companies like Twitter and Google, but my mission and my passion around this subject really comes from my own personal experience. But I'm on a mission to create the most diverse company in the world, and I think we can do it. A little bit about Better. Better is a digital-first homeownership company. We have services that include mortgage, real estate, title, and homeownership insurance. And me and my team were really dedicated to finding the best talent and in creating opportunities and pathways for talent from non-traditional backgrounds as well. And we're trying to take a little creative approach to it as well. We're really committed to seeking candidates from underestimated talent pools and addressing barriers of entry that prevent this talent from being hired and advancing through technical interview processes. Yeah.
You're going to be digging into that topic. Great, Masha.
Hello, everyone. I am glad to be here with you all. My name is Masha Ka, and I am the head of outreach and inclusion at DocuSign. And really, my job is all about how do we make diversity real? And what we know is that that is not just about who we can bring to the table, but how we include them, how we retain them, and how we help them grow. So I spend a lot of my time and energy thinking about ways to really think outside of the box for diversity and inclusion. I think we often see very programmatic, initiative-led strategies around D&I, and really there's an opportunity for us to be thinking analytically, systemically, and then also how we sustain things, the different pieces and portions of our strategy. I have spent my last decade and a half working for tech companies like Google, Twitter, Dropbox, Eventbrite. I've spent a lot of time kind of dissecting the HR facets of diversity and inclusion. So I think a lot about how diversity and inclusion are embedded in our HR practices, even when we don't mention them. So there are the verbal things and the processes that we all agree upon, and there are those unwritten, unagreed upon things that just kind of happen. And I find that in those cracks lie inequity. And so I'm always trying to figure out ways to break that cycle, and definitely excited to sit with all of you and discuss this a little bit more today. Thanks.
I may be stealing that line for so I really like the way that you put that. Thank you.
Got it.
Rita.
I think I want to steal all of Masha's intro. I was nodding the whole way through. Yes. So I'm Rita Giacalone. I head up culture, diversity, and belonging at Autodesk. Autodesk is a SaaS company that makes software that helps people make things. So we're in manufacturing, construction, architecture, as well as in media and entertainment. We're about a 40-year-old company, headquartered in the Bay Area with a little over 10,000 employees. In terms of my role and how I entered into this role, I'm actually took a little bit of a circuitous path. I'm a clinical psychologist. So I'm fascinated by human systems and dynamics and what makes people tick the way they do, with one another. So came into the field through the OD pathway of organizational development with an emphasis on culture. And as I mentioned, we are the culture, diversity, and belonging team. So we really feel like culture is foundational to the possibility of diversity and belonging thriving at an organization. So we also are we are transforming and attending very intentionally to our culture, okay? And then and how diversity and belonging is embedded in everything we do from a culture code perspective, that it's considered even in decision making. If you change a decision making framework, for example, how do you create inclusive practices within that? So that's the approach we're taking. The role is exciting. We just went through a very big strategic planning effort over the past year and a half, and we're actioning those efforts and work very closely with our TA team as well. So look forward to the discussion today.
Thank you. I find it so interesting the way that everyone sort of slightly adjusts their DEI practitioner role's title. And I think that it speaks volumes to what the company's intentions and focus is on, you know, especially with their mission. Obviously, culture is very important at Autodesk. Last but not least, Jeffrey.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for having me. Just by way of background, I kind of worked with startups, helped grow startups kind of from early in my career. And then I spent the last 6 years before founding Karat at the Gates Foundation. I'm really personally motivated by where business and social good intersect. And kind of that's why Karat is also a very mission-driven company. Karat, oh, Steve did a great job actually introducing Karat, so I'll try and build on top of what he said. But Karat, it was founded under the idea that interviewing is too important to be something that is like a secondary job for somebody. And so we are professionalizing interviewing. And the way that we do that is we have a network of software engineers around the world that we have vetted and equipped to be great interviewers. We call them interview engineers. And then top companies and leading companies leverage our network to conduct interviews on their behalf, and mostly technical interviews. We have currently conducted about 100,000 so far. And so we then leverage all that data from the interviews and hiring outcomes to help our clients build more efficient and inclusive hiring processes. So we really take what we do very seriously, because we know that we're kind of everything we do gets amplified because we're not just interviewing for our company and who we're hiring, but all the other companies that we work with and how they hire. And we're kind of, you know, we can either be a gateway or an enabler, right, of people who are getting access to jobs. In terms of where we are in our inclusion efforts, I'd say, you know, we've kind of always had DEI in our DNA, but we've been a lot more intentional lately about like, how do we think about inclusivity? And so we've created our flagship purpose program called Brilliant Black Minds, which we can get into later if interesting. And like we have internship programs and things, but we've really tried to embed inclusion into the like core practices that we use on a day-to-day basis. So that's like performance management systems, pay. We have a whole initiative right now on how to run inclusive meetings. And so, you know, we're trying to do it both in like how people show up every day, and then at like a broader, like kind of investment level at the company.
Inclusive meetings, so interesting, because as we transition to hybrid perhaps work or back to being fully in person, how are we going to do that in the most emotionally intelligent and inclusive way? But that's a whole other webinar that we can that we can have. So obviously I've been a reporter for a lot of years and focusing on diversity for at least the last 10. And the thing that always comes up when I talk to any source about diversity hiring in particular is the pipeline problem. So that's where I want to start. Let's set some context. And I feel like it's the elephant in the room. Do you think there is a pipeline problem? And I'm asking this of all of you, so we're going to do the round robin again. Masha, start with you.
Yeah, I'm glad you started with me. I actually used to be a teacher. And so I spent a bit of time in the education system in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania area. And I can tell you the pipeline problem definitely exists. My thought process on this is a couple of things. One, systemically, we have created a education system that really is geared at helping people to work kind of in factories because of how we've built our systems. We have very rote memorization systems. We ask students to sit up straight and put on a uniform and fall in line. But we know in the tech industry and in corporate America in general, innovation is the next wave. We have to be creative. We have to be on the edge of our toes and ready to go at a moment's notice. And I think that's something we're not preparing our students for. The other thing that I would say is a problem with the pipeline is really more around how we are thinking about the talent that we bring into our communities. So when we say there's a problem with the pipeline, that's because we have a checklist of things that we are trying to tally off that say this makes a good employee. What we're not thinking about are being innovative in that space, being creative in that space, thinking outside of the box in terms of what's the experience that we need in order to really be an excellent salesperson, an excellent engineer, an excellent marketer. There are lots of transferable skills that we really don't take a lot of time to assess and include in our checklist. And so our pipeline problem may be more perceived in some instances than it is real.
I'm glad you kind of turned it at the end, because I feel like I read a stat recently about particularly Black women college graduates. There is no shortage of Black female college graduates. So you can't say like, oh, the education level isn't there in one regard. Also, the number of engineers that are coming out of HBCUs
Skyrocketing.
is really, yes, is really growing. So, okay, who's going to take the other side of this? That there is no pipeline problem. Go ahead, Ivory.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree with Masha. I would say, like, I don't think there's truly a pipeline problem. I think there's other things that exist. When we think about pipeline, a lot of, especially within recruiting organizations, we focus on going to find the talent and just ensuring that we have more representation at the top of the funnel. The problem that exists is if the process itself is inequitable, if our interviews are already screening out people of color, women, or people with disabilities and other communities, then the problem is within the pipeline, the process. Also, if the hiring managers are looking for maybe someone that looks like someone on their team, then we're going to continue to build these homogenous teams and not being able to ensure that we have more representation and not sure we have more diversity. So I think there's other things that exist that create this idea like it's just a pipeline problem. But if we are able to fix the process, if we're able to influence hiring managers to get on board and also train our recruiters to be able to go out and find the talent and where they can find it, then we will be more successful.
Yeah, and I want to get into the nuts and bolts of where and why for, but Rita, you have some.
Yeah, so a bit of a different take on the pipeline problem. And where the pipeline problem exists, I think Masha was alluding to. When you have, let's say, the Black demographic or the Latinx demographic, Black demographic being 13% of the US population, Latinx being 18% of the US population. And then you look at the professional population within these demographic groups, 9% for the Black population. I believe it's 11% for the Latinx population. The pipeline problem lies in that delta, right? And that's systemic in nature. It is in education, it's in access, it's in systemic inequity. So the pipeline problem is there. We know that for the Black workforce, professional workforce, for example, we should be at or above 9% of that population if we are accessing folks who are available. Like you said, there are plenty of people out there. It's about changing the culture of where you look for talent, changing the culture of talent acquisition, changing the culture, that the mindset of hiring managers. We're speaking to all of this, but it's about what you're actively doing within a company to shift that mindset and to train people in practices that actually not only tap this talent, but mitigate for bias relative to examining and considering the talent.
Jeffrey?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think it's easy to blame the pipeline or the pool of candidates for not being qualified. And I think it's an excuse that certain companies make because they haven't hit diversity hiring goals. It affords them the opportunity to not look inward to figure out, like, hey, do we have systemic issues going on? Is there sexism or racism in our processes? Like, do we have biases? So you have companies that are not actually doing the hard work to make the change that needs to happen. I think, everything that I've personally experienced and also all the interviews that we've done, I think we are very confident that there is tons of underrepresented talent out there that is qualified and that is overlooked. And that there are roles that would befit their qualifications and their promise. A a lot of the people that are underrepresented are also the first in their family or their professional networks to try and get a job in tech, let's say, or in other industries. And therefore they don't have access to the same information about like, what does it take to get a job? What does the job search process look like? What does the interviewing process look like? And so one of the things we're really trying to do is like, how do you democratize access to that information, right? I think that the ultimate problem is that companies don't know how to access this population. They don't know how to assess this population, and they don't really know how to support this population and make them feel included.
Mm-hmm. I don't often jump to audience Q&A until the end, but one of our audience members brought up something that ties into my next question. So Jana, forgive me if I'm not saying your name correctly, but says, in Nebraska, we have 2,500 open tech positions every day. The experience of the coasts is very different from middle America. And my question was, is the ability to work remotely a way to widen the pipeline of talent? Because people can be anywhere. So therefore, theoretically, employers don't have that geographic barrier that they can only draw from the Bay Area or only draw from Silicon Alley in New York. Nodding heads, who's got some thoughts on this? Remote work. Can we tackle the tech pipeline issue in middle America if people are working remotely? Rita?
I think the answer is definitively yes. Right? You're casting a wider net. You're tapping into talent pools that potentially, out of choice or out of necessity can't live in very expensive, cities. So there's not a question that remote. I have an example on my own team. I was just able to hire somebody remotely who I wouldn't have been able to hire had we had this person have to be attached to an office. And I am thrilled about that. We're seeing more and more of that. I want to say, in addition to remote work, though, is location strategy. If you are really thinking and using tools to see where that talent lies, that untapped talent, and you're locating physical offices or even satellite offices in those areas, and really making yourself available, and then having leaders buy in to build out their orgs in those areas, we're seeing a lot of success there as well. So I think that we're going to be seeing a lot of progress as a result of this post-pandemic future of work or way of work that we're moving towards. I'd
like to say yes, and to Rita.
Oh, we're doing improv now? Yes, and.
It's going to be a good time. I'm looking forward to it. My thought process is this. I think that's exactly right. I think we have a lot of opportunity for growth by opening up our workforce to remote opportunities. I think the challenge that I would caution, and what I'm like, if I could get on a bullhorn and just let everybody know from the mountaintops that we have to be thinking about this in terms of being remote first versus remote friendly. And my trouble with this is that I think sometimes we create these like second-class citizens of our remote workers. And if we use diversity, or if we use remote work to diversify rather, then we start to create second-class citizenship between diverse populations in our communities and in our corporations. And my thought process with this is that when we say we're remote friendly, usually what happens is that we are open to remote workers, but we start to promote the people who we are nearest and dearest to. We start to promote the people who are around us every day, who come into the office. Or we start to isolate the leadership in the office and then put all of the individual contributors in their home offices. And so what I would just throw caution for everyone into is, how do we really start to create some parity in terms of whose voice is valued no matter where they are in the world? And how do we value them? How do we ensure that there's, to Rita's point, that culture that exists in our companies, regardless of the fact that there are some people in the office and some people over here and some people part-time in the office? It's really a matter of creating a very inclusive strategy to remote I believe, remote first work, as opposed to trying to be remote friendly and really finding ourselves falling short.
I think that we had this moment that was sort of an equalizer for a lot of people. When you see everyone in the same size box on a screen, it's very different than sitting around a conference room, very different than, you know, that hierarchy where who sits at the table and who's sitting on the windowsill. And to your point, Masha, yes, people potentially could be inequitably dealt with because they're not being seen. So that, in a sense, is more of a systemic inequity that has potential to unfold. What I'm also thinking about is, though, just what's currently in existence as a way that is a barrier to even getting in the door. And so, Jeffrey, I wanted to ask you about what you see is, I mean, you mentioned access before. What's the biggest barrier to entry to underrepresented talent?
Yeah, I think that the biggest barrier is people's preconceived notions of what good looks like, right? And historically, even if you just take sourcing, it's people go to, what school did you go to? Where did you work before? And that is very limiting. I think when the panelists here was kind of talking about, like, we have to change what we think about, like, what good looks like. Let's just take, for example, active candidates, people who apply directly, right? Who apply to your website. They don't know anyone at your company. They don't necessarily have the networks that somebody has to get a referral in. There's a huge bias against active candidates for passive candidates. And most of the companies we work for, when we start working with them, they only source about 10% of they only interview about 10% of the people who apply actively. And yet those people do just as well on the interviews as the people that they've sourced, right? And so we're kind of constantly pushing them to be like, you should go to 20% or 30% or a bigger percentage of that population who's not in your network and is actively demonstrated they want to work at your company. Like, it's like just sitting there kind of right for you. And it should be about the underlying competencies, not like what school they went to and where they worked before. And what's interesting, even after that stage, for any given level of like performance on the Karat interview, right? We see a trend where at the on-site loop, they tend to do worse. Like, underrepresented talent tends to do worse, which is like people that work at a Google or went to MIT or something tend to get the benefit of the doubt in an interview loop. Whereas if people are looking for a reason to say yes, and sometimes with underrepresented talent, they're looking for a reason to say no, right? And so that ends up in like these different ratios. And then this impact kind of compounds upon itself, because it's like if somebody who's underrepresented doesn't get that job, then their network has a harder time getting the job. Their network has less access to the information about what it takes to get a job. And then it just kind of compounds upon itself and gets worse and worse.
So we're essentially talking about a form of confirmation bias, where you were talking about looking for a reason to say yes versus a reason to say no, which is a very common unconscious bias that is definitely a barrier to entry. So then the next logical question is, how do we overcome those stumbling blocks at the talent acquisition level for starters? What do we need to do? What strategies can people employ to fix that? And this is for all of you. So, but Jeffrey, you can offer some advice, and then we'll go around the room again.
Sure. I mean, I think on that front, it's really, you're going to have to diversify where you go to access talent and like build. And it's not enough just to go somewhere and say, hey, I'm here, like I want to hire you. You actually have to like change your company and be a mission-oriented company and be an inclusive company. And people can see that, even because you can do all this work to actually get the person in the door, then they're going to kind of have a leaky bucket on the other end. But even more than that is, if you do that work, people want to come work for you, right? I'd say most of the people that come and interview at Karat are talking about our mission and like making things more fair in hiring, right? So we get kind of draw in people if they see an article or they see something about what we're doing. So I think for companies, it's like, do the hard work and then promote that hard work, so that other people can actually learn about your company and you'll attract in the type of people that also share those inclusive values.
I agree. working on making better the most diverse company. What does this strategy look like in a day-to-day way that somebody could just, kind of take some points from and start making it work for them?
Yeah, honestly, I would say +1 to everything Jeffrey just said. One thing that we're doing at Better is starting internally, because if we focus on just trying to recruit as many people from underestimated communities as possible, and we haven't done the work internally, we're just going to lose them quicker than we hire them. So one, we're starting with educating our employees on what does diversity mean, what is actually happening in these communities, how can we address our biases and understand like what our biases are, but also how can we hire and be as inclusive as possible. So that's the groundwork that we are doing internally with our employees. We're also working with our hiring managers, sharing with them data around where our employees are and what our employee makeup looks like, addressing gaps when it comes to racial and gender diversity, also looking at intersectionality as well, to ensure that our hiring managers are very well informed and also our leaders. And I think the next piece is from there, educating our recruiters, showing them where we can find the talent, partnering with organizations that have access to this talent so that we can create long-term engagement points with talent from underestimated communities. So that's where we're starting at Better.
Let me just pause briefly because we have to have a word from our sponsor. So I'm going to invite Steve and then we'll go finish up the round.
Great, thanks, Lydia. Hi, folks. I'd like to remind anyone joining our webinar in midstream that we're from day one and we're exploring how to break down barriers to build a more diverse tech workforce. Our sponsor is Karat. As a reminder, you can submit your questions at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll answer as many as we can during the Q&A session in about 15 minutes. Now back to you, Lydia.
Thank you. Okay, Masha, what does this look like on a day-to-day if you had to offer somebody some best practices?
Absolutely. I echo the thoughts in this room, and I would add a few other points. One is writing everything down. I think in diversity and inclusion, and sometimes in HR in general, we have this tendency to really think of it as this like fluffy science. It's like, there's nebulous and we don't really know where we're going and what's happening. We got to stop that. We need hard facts, data. We need to be able to measure where our success is coming from. And so in order to do that, we need a baseline of all of that data. And then we need a strategy that literally just lists out, here are the 5 things we're going to be doing that are going to impact it. Maybe it's with regard to recruiting training. Maybe it's with regard to outreach or sourcing, whatever it is. And then we're going to say, how are we going to measure it? And every quarter, we're going to come back and say, did we do this well? What didn't work? Where's the postmortem? What is about to break that we didn't even consider, right? Ask the questions that no one's willing to ask. The other thing that I would add to that is really this notion around thinking about this. We talk about embedding diversity and inclusion everywhere, but we don't actually have a systemic way of doing that. At DocuSign, we actually have an individual who's embedded in different parts of our business to ensure that when performance conversations are happening, there's a D&I beacon of hope in that room to make sure that there's someone holding us accountable there. Same with our retention strategies, our HR business partners here in talent acquisition and thinking really about outreach and sourcing. We really try to make sure that in every room, there's someone responsible for inclusive thinking and conversation. And then the last thing that I will add with regard to this, I probably could keep going, but I know we've got a short time. The last thing I'll add to this is really that it takes intentional kind of like seeds to build the tree that we want. And so what I would say about those seeds is that we need executive sponsorship. Who are the people in your company who are going to bat for this issue? You need people on the ground, individual contributors who are just talking the talk. And then you need some people who are kind of bystanders and just listening. And if you're thinking about all of those different seeds that will eventually create this tree, you have to think about how you're kind of playing the game with those seeds, if you will, to make sure that they're building upon each other, that the executive sponsor isn't working in one vein and all the other individual contributors are doing something completely different that really don't work together, or maybe in some cases are counterproductive to one another. And so really the goal for me is to think about that strategy. What are the markers that we need each person to be involved in? And then how are we holding ourselves accountable when we track our success in that?
Yeah, data is certainly important, but I want to, well, I'm going to let Rita go first, but I am thinking about the structural part of the interview process. So we'll come back to that because I think that's really an integral part of all of this. Go ahead, Rita, you wanted to add?
So I won't answer on the structural part of interviewing. I'll
Oh,
provide.
no, you can, because that's where I'm going next. So that's fine. Go ahead.
I was just thinking of providing a couple of anecdotal success stories in the midst of challenge. I don't want to make it sound like we have all the answers. We do not. But hiring manager boot camp. Okay, we have revamped hiring manager boot camp. It is required. It is 12 hours in length. There is an inclusive hiring module, but DEI is embedded in all of it. And what we did is there was our CIO organization needed to make a significant amount of hires in Bangalore, for example, Bangalore, India. And what we did beforehand was a team member of mine went in and did a hiring manager bootcamp refresher with all of those managers. There was a lot of ahas in that experience. And what we found, one, we surveyed them to understand what their ahas were. But then when they moved into the hiring mode, they hired 35% women, which is about 7 percentage points above the professional availability of women in Bangalore. The other thing we did, from a holistic perspective, is look at our total rewards and where were the gaps for women in terms of benefits in India, and then be able to accentuate benefits and speak to them very actively in the recruitment process. So once again, it's cultural with the hiring managers. And then it's having people be seen and valued so that that you're really reflecting what their needs are. That's one example. From a partnership example, what we engaged in was an Hbcu tech program, and this starts from a congressional, right? It's a congressional group, and we got involved to support that. And we were able to bring in many students from 4 different HBCUs for a 6-month stint, aligned with our teams, so that they were able to. It's kind of like on the job, right? On the job training with ancillary offerings in terms of presenting skills, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And with stretch projects and presentations relative to those projects. What that's enabled us to do is develop positive relationship with schools and extend to the summer months, for example, to redo this program in the fall. So we're finding that when you really invest time, deep time, and teams are volunteering time and effort, you're able to build those relationships that are lasting, not one-offs.
Mm-hmm. I did want to go back to the thorny question about the interview process, particularly when it comes to technical interviews, because, everybody knows how challenging those can be. It's not like you're sitting there and you're answering a bunch of behavioral questions. Like, a lot of times you have to go to the whiteboard and show your work, which, even to people who are extroverted, I think, they'd be getting sweaty palms and, so this is a dual question do you think that this entire conundrum revolves around this one particular point, the interview process? Because as Jeffrey said, some people are looking for a reason to say no because confirmation bias isn't there. And what structural changes can be made to make the interview process more equitable? and more inclusive. And so, Jeffrey, you first, because you have
Yeah.
an insider's look on this.
Well, I think, first of all, I'd just say, I think, Rita, it's amazing that you're doing so much training of your hiring managers. That's probably a unique program, and really great to hear that it's had success. I don't know if it's the entire, like the singular point of like, hey, this is, if we fix this thing, like everything would just flow and it would, we'd be successful. But there's a lot of room for improvement. I think you touched on the word structure. I mean, I think there's kind of two big issues, is like the lack of professionalism and the lack of structure, right? And that really affects things. And so the lack of professionalism is like, who interviews? It tends to be the people who have the most time, or the time available, not the person who's, trained, who wants to be there, who's actually really good at interviewing, right? And that tends to end up being like, that leads to more bias and a bad candidate experience. People are in the room. You have these horror stories of like the person who's just trying to make you feel dumb, like, I want to prove to you that I'm smarter than you. That's not who you want in your interviewing process, and it's really intimidating, right? And then on the structure, we take an approach and we kind of say, how do we reduce bias at Karat? It's structural, not personal, right? Where we still do unconscious bias training for our interviewers and things, but at the end of the day, it's harder to check your biases every single time they come up, especially if they are unconscious. It's a lot easier. Hey, we don't even look at the resume before you go into an interview. They don't even know what your background is, right? We actually separate out like whether or not the recommendation someone's making from the actual, like what they fill out in their rubric of what they demonstrated. So you don't have likability in there. You can't just be like, oh, I bonded because we went, or they wouldn't know you went to the same school, but we joked around about something in the interview, and now I'm going to give you a thumbs up, whereas you didn't actually demonstrate the underlying competencies. So I think, we really need to improve the structure and the professionalism. And then just the last point is that access to information is really, really important. Of like, everybody should know exactly what the interviewing process is, what competencies you're assessing for. And I think one of the things that I would say people at Karat are the proudest of is that we offer every candidate a redo opportunity. So that means if you didn't do well in your first interview and you think, you know what, I just didn't show up well, or I didn't understand what the process was like, and I want to take that interview again, we'll interview you again with a different interviewer and a different question. And that has huge impacts on underrepresented talent. We see them do much better in the second interview than the first interview, because now they're like, oh, now I know what the situation is like. So I think that's really important too.
I'm thinking particularly of, the last 12 to 15 months where a lot of the process had to go virtual. What has changed, and have there been any improvements because people can't sit across from each other? I mean, I'm the eternal optimist with stuff like this, and maybe I shouldn't be, but does anyone have thoughts on if virtual interviewing made things more equitable? Go ahead, Audrey, you're nodding your head.
Yeah, I think virtual interviewing definitely caused some challenges, right? Like, we all had to think about like, how can we change our process to make it more inclusive? How do we think about folks from different communities? And when I think about interviewing virtually, the first thing that comes to my head is someone that is differently abled and may have an invisible disability, or maybe visible. And how do we create an inclusive process for them? So if it's training our hiring managers and interviewers on how to do like closed captionings and things like that, like how do you create a process for them and for anyone else as well? So I think it definitely caused some challenges, and it really helped us to understand, like, one, we need to start building for every type of person, and we need to understand like what are the needs of our candidates, so that we can be able to show up and create a experience for them that makes them want to show up and feel included and comfortable.
I wanted to chime in on a couple tactics and techniques that maybe folks can use. One is creating a pre-brief. So literally listing the competencies or attributes that you are looking for, and then having specific interviewers looking for those things. So when I am coming in to assess project management, and then all of a sudden I start talking to you about the candidate's technical know-how, you can say, hold up, pause, that's not your area to review. We're just looking at project management for the moment. And then with regard to the technical interviews in particular, my thought process is actually to give multiple opportunities. I love what Jeffrey's talking about this redo opportunity. at DocuSign, we also consider giving 3 interviews. So it's not just you get the problem right or wrong on the first technical try, but you actually have 3 different technical questions to answer. And then literally each different interviewer is able to say yay or nay. And it's not just based on whether or not you checked the box and got it right, but also your thought process, how you went through the problem, how you were able to explain it, and the way in which you communicated any difficulties you were having, problems, questions that you were able to think through and ask that were relevant. And I think the way that that is structured allows for there not to be this kind of like tiebreaker moment where it's like one interviewer says, yes, this was exactly right, they passed this with flying colors, and the other one's like, no, absolutely not, they couldn't figure it out. Instead, you have 3 different perspectives. And I think that's one thing that remote work has allowed us to do a lot more of, because people don't have to travel for these interviews. We can hop on a Zoom, takes 30 minutes, and it's not, 30 minutes plus commute time. And so I really encourage folks to consider giving more touch points and opportunities for these communities to show you what they've got.
Would you look at the time? It's it's time for our audience Q&A. I had 8 more questions for you all myself, but I don't want to hog the mic here. I want to turn it over to some of these attendee questions. One of which we haven't touched on yet. How important is the onboarding and new on the job period in terms of helping new hires feel like they belong and are getting off to a good start? Onboarding process thoughts. How can that be more inclusive?
Well, I can't say enough about how critical it is. It's crucial. I think, what I say, belonging starts at hello, right? Frankly, belonging starts during the interview process, and then when a person is truly onboarded, it's so important that there's consistency and structure to onboarding, that people from underrepresented groups are given onboarding buddies, are introduced to their prospective ERGs, so there's a welcome from lots of different directions. And once again, I'm going to bring up those managers, right? The managers are trained in onboarding. So we have an onboarding toolkit that really guides managers through this process and what considerations they need to have in mind as they welcome somebody into the family. It's been fascinating because from an engagement standpoint, our remote employees, we have a COVID cohort of almost 2,000 people. I think because of the intentionality that we had to approach our new employees with, their experiences have been extremely positive from the standpoint of inclusion and belonging, based on what we're seeing on our, we assess belonging, inclusion, engagement, etc. So I want to applaud our managers in particular. We're doing something right. And how do we sustain that when we move back into a post-COVID world, frankly? So it's structure, consistency, and lots of support,
Jeffrey, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, well, first of all, I completely agree. Onboarding is incredibly important for inclusion. It's it actually starts, to your point, way back in the sourcing and the first touch point that you have with somebody. But one of the things that we've been trying to think about is how do you turn an interview from a transaction that doesn't produce value into something that is an asset that we can use to give you feedback to improve if you don't get the job. Right. But also, why is it that you get the job, there are 8 people at the company or something who have judged you in the interviewing process, and you're the only one who doesn't understand or know what they think about you when you walk in, right? So, it's kind of like doing a performance review where everybody shared their thoughts and then nobody shared it with the person coming in the door. So in that first month, it should, the manager should sit down and say, hey, this is where we saw your greatest strengths. Here's where we thought your areas of growth were, and let's work on that as part of the plan. And it's not this is what your colleagues think of you too. So just one kind of small idea of how to help in the onboarding process and make sure that you're building team cohesion.
That's a great idea. Talking about hiring again, I continue to hear hiring managers talk about rapid hiring due to unplanned resignations. Therefore, the go-to is hire people within their network, AKA low-hanging fruit, but it tends to be people who look like them. So to Ivory and Masha's point, this continues to be homogenous. How do you recommend educating leaders on this point? So not everybody has this issue, but for those who are doing rapid hiring, who are scaling up, how do you educate the leaders not to pick from their existing network?
Early and often. Literally.
There you go.
I think that that's a really great point. And time is such a hard conversation, especially in a fast growing organization. DocuSign, as you can imagine, this pandemic hit and we blew up and it was great. It's awesome. You know, e-signature business, our agreement cloud is definitely a place where people are turning to in the midst of a lot of hardship. That means quick hiring, that means quick wins, that means a lot of sales for the business, but it also means that people feel like there's an internal clock that we're racing against to make sure that we can hit all of these metrics and support all of the growing business. Now, one thought that I have on this is that the conversation around diversity and inclusion is really that we are fixing a problem we didn't start. It is a centuries old problem. It is not something that we can turn around and fix in a minute. And so the question that I ask of my hiring managers and my executive leaders is, how bad do you want it? Do you want it? And that's really the question, because now it doesn't become, you know, do I want this or that? It's really, I want both. How do I make that happen? And so over a longer term period of time, that takes people saying yes in some instances, hey, this is critical, we've got to make the hire. We didn't have as diverse a slate of candidates as we would have liked. Next time, we're putting in an extra month of buffer time for sourcing for that particular role. So we're gonna make sure that team as a whole diversifies and grows. And so it's really a matter of thinking about the growth of your team as a strategic long-term play. Each head that you bring onto the team, it's just like if you're like, I'm not a great sports person, but first draft pick for the NBA, you know, you're like in the zone, you've got the right person, it feels right now, but you're thinking about the team holistically. So you're looking at other teams and watching other players and thinking about who's gonna be the right manager for this role, who's gonna be the right director for the next role. And then you start cultivating those relationships early and often. And so that becomes the question, how bad do you want it? How bad do you want it? And then when people say, I want it this badly, then it's like, okay, I need an extra month the next time that we do this, because it's not gonna work. We're gonna continue hitting our heads against that wall.
Something related to this is a question from Leslie talking about this more holistic approach. Do you find that diversity recruiting paired with diversity succession planning aids in retaining diverse employees? My company is evaluating gaps in our succession planning process, and I see a correlation between that program, diversity recruiting, and our turnover. I have not yet talked about succession planning with a diversity lens yet. So anyone who can enlighten me and answer Leslie's question, I am all ears. Hands raised? Okay, go.
I want to hog the mic, so I was going to be quiet and wait. But that's definitely something that I'm constantly working with our HR business partners and our leaders in particular. And the real reason is, to Jeffrey's point of that leaky pipeline, we can bring as many people to the table, but if we haven't thought about their growth and their succession within our organization, then they won't stay. And to be honest, we are kind of in this incestuous pool where people are incentivized for moving from place to place. They do so with compensation bonuses, they do so with relocation bonuses. Now we're doing so with all kinds of other benefits like, you know, free lunch or access to this car, what have you. And so realistically, what we need to be doing is finding spaces for our I will say untapped communities and underutilized communities to really see themselves, see a path forward within the organization. Sometimes that looks like a role, like I want to be director. I need to get to that space. How do I do that? And you work with your manager to kind of put in place the stepping blocks to get there. Other times it's really more about experience. I want to be able to lead a team. So how do I do that? Can I be the leader of a project team that we're doing? Maybe it's I want to explore AI, or I want to explore employee relations, any field that I haven't thought about. Can I do what we call bungee assignments, where I just join that team for a portion of our work year? And realistically, what you'll start to find is that every employee has a different driver, a different intrinsic motivation that's calling them to be a part of your organization. And so we don't have to give the same leverage points to each employee in order to keep them feeling like they have that growth and that pathway forward. It's really about being individualized and flexible in terms of how we support our employees. And then once we do that, we can say, wow, we've been able to retain 5% more individuals through this bungee program. Once we've done that, we can say, you know, we've been able to promote 5% more individuals because of this succession planning. And then we find ourselves not having to stop that leaky pipeline, but instead really just growing in true fashion.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that. Rita, I'm coming to you next, but I just wanted to clarify. When I hear succession planning, I think about leadership rolling out so that someone else can come in, not necessarily professional development, which it sounds like more of what you were addressing. Am I right?
I mean both. So actually, when I say that, I mean, so if I'm the director in this role who's planning to leave, whoever the individuals are who may want to be a director, those are the individuals that I need to lean into.
Got it.
So it's really around creating that tie back from the leaders that are there, having them look at their team and say, what are the opportunities that would help you to grow into my position? And then giving them those opportunities. But that's a great point. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, sorry, Rita, go ahead.
Yeah, no, just a bit of a programmatic lens. And frankly, I think Autodesk, you know, we have to build out approaches that are effective in terms of succession planning, what it is that we're looking at. And you know, like our TA is doing their job. When we just looked at our numbers, they're doing their job. It's good stuff. How do you retain and promote, right? So programmatically, what do we know? Mentoring is great and very supportive of that, but it's sponsorship that gets that person to the next level. It's building out informal networks that get that person to the next level. So you have an executive invested in these individuals who have been identified as your next leaders, right? So what we are going to do is build out a very formal sponsorship program. Oftentimes people have the impression that sponsorship has to happen very organically. I don't agree with that. Yeah. I think we need to create accountability on the part of our leaders to invest in our community and really bring people along and advocate for people.
So in a very structured way, you're saying.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And then you have stay interviews and you have focused IDPs where executives are sitting down and saying, okay, what's that next step? And how do we get you there? So, so you're providing focused attention. Right. And then people they feel invested in because they are invested.
Yeah.
You know?
Ivory, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I think the biggest piece when it comes to recruiting and retention is around accountability, holding our leaders accountable. If our leaders aren't bought into creating diverse teams and even keeping their talent, then we're going to lose them and we're not going to be able to hire them. So one thing that we do at Better is we take a data-driven approach. I think leaders and even us as people, we tend to rely on data to see what's actually happening versus then using our actual eyes. So if we can look at the data and we can see where our talent sits from a leveling perspective and look at it by race and gender and see that maybe our director levels, we don't have anyone that identifies as Black or Latinx or as a woman. and our VP doesn't identify as that as well, then we have a problem there, because then the next, the bench that could be a VP is not going to be from a representative community at all. So how do we think about that? How do we tap into talent that are at lower levels, help develop them and create plans to ensure that we have a bench for when a leader is ready to move out and we can move folks up so that we can create a more representative leadership team. Because when you think about companies, especially in the tech industry, I think there's a lot of focus on the entry level point to bring in diverse talent. But at the leadership point, it gets very hard. So how can we think about how can we develop our people that maybe at the mid-level to get to leadership level so that we have more diversity in our executive teams?
Well, gosh, we are totally out of time and we haven't gotten to everybody's questions. So I'm just going to give a quick shout out. Thank you all, Jeffrey, Rita, Ivory, Masha. If anyone didn't get their question answered, please feel free to connect with us individually on LinkedIn or via their website. Over to you, Steve.
Thanks, Lydia, and our wonderful speakers. That was a great conversation, and thank you again to our sponsor, Karat, and to all of you who participated today. Before we sign off, in case you missed it at the top of the hour, I'm going to share something special we have for attendees of today's webinar. Our monthly virtual conference will be next Wednesday, June 16th, and it's about the new benefits employees need and want today. Thanks to today's sponsor, we're offering a VIP ticket to everyone joining today's webinar. It's complimentary. They're normally $149, so you'll want to grab one while you can. I've placed the link in the chat space again. To find out more about that event and other virtual events, you can head to our website, fromday1.co. Check out our upcoming webinars. 2 of them are coming right up. On Thursday, June 24th, our webinar is titled Toward a More Inclusive LGBTQ Outlook in Corporate America. Tuesday, June 29th, it's about how companies can find and vet the right partner for social impact. Thanks, everyone. Stay well.